Great. We're in the second book of prophecies, so-called. Isaiah did not write books, but he had themes within certain topics. And we remember how in the first book, we saw him begin to see Emmanuel, God with us. He began to see prophecies regarding a coming one, a Messiah, one born, coming into Galilee and born with the government upon his shoulder, and with a government and a kingdom that would never end. Now we're in book 2, and it's a book of judgments, right? Now, we need to remember something. First of all, I don't know if you know this, but the word judgment and the word righteousness really comes from the same word, dikaio, in Greek, and it means straight. All of the judgments of God are the straightening of things. As we all often say, God is all right. He is always right. He does right in all its actions, and he makes right. So he is in the process of making right his children. Israel, his covenant children, to be sure, but they've gone astray in so many ways that by the time we come to Isaiah, we have a kingdom that is beginning to fail, and soon Judah, within 100 years, will go into Babylonian captivity because of their unfaithfulness. So as we look at these prophecies, let's just remember this. In the positive side, if we look at it from the cross side, we see the Lord is just adjusting and straightening out his people, making them ready so that they can live and thrive in his righteous kingdom. Unrighteousness cannot abide in his righteous kingdom. So he's straightening out these crooked the children of his, even as he's doing that with us. So I hope you can lay hold of that simple thought. So here we have this collection by Isaiah of the judgments of the nations. Isaiah sees Jehovah upon the throne in great power over the global nations, over all politics. And he's using the nations to discipline his people, and also to discipline the nations, to bring the nations to himself, really. So from Assyria, which is the very present threat in the days of Isaiah, right through the Egypt, which we'll see next Monday, God willing, God is purposed with a purpose. He says, last week we saw that. God has purposed with a purpose. What? That Emmanuel will rule the nations from Zion. There's his goal, the eternal purpose. That's what he's after. That's what's going on. Okay? Now, we see these nations being judged, and there is a priority. There is a list, and these 9 nations that will be judged in one way or another all reveal God in his righteous judgments. So these chapters 13 through 23 is a revelation of Jehovah's sovereignty over the nations, and it's seen in 4 dimensions. So the nations think they're free of Jehovah, but they're not at all. They're under his throne, and he sovereignly rules. Heaven rules. So here's the 4 ways that we see his sovereign judgment over the nations. 1, he exposes Satan's work behind the nations and their battles, etc. 2, he shows the legitimate ground of God's judgments upon men and the nations. These grounds are explained. He's a righteous judge, so he just doesn't condemn somebody, but he gives them the reasons for his judgments. Number 3, God's mercy is shown, which uses even the nations to restore Israel to their inheritance. God is using nations to squeeze and straighten Israel into one, where they are upright and are ready to receive their inheritance in a millennium kingdom. And number 4, all that he is doing behind the scenes is a sovereign preparation for his son's eventual installation or coronation in a righteous kingdom. So we see all of these 4 principles in the background of the judgments of the nations in these various chapters. So as an example, we see he starts with Babylon, right? That's the burden number one. That's the first time he says Masa. That's that word burden or oracle or pronouncement, right? Jehovah's first priority is this: Babel is driven by evil spiritual power, Lucifer. You remember chapter 14 kind of morphed from talking about the king of Babylon, like Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar, as our brother spoke yesterday afternoon. And behind him, we see this Lucifer trying to get to the mountains of God and to be like God and to really dispossess the Son of God from his position under the God of gods. So this evil spiritual power must be judged and destroyed. That comes first. But then second behind it was the burden for Assyria, if you'll remember in Isaiah chapter 14. Assyria is the second in judgment because their leaders were empowered by world rulers of this darkness. And here we have the story of Asher and of Nineveh and of Nimrod, who moved there. And he had a spirit of domination as a mighty hunter. And everywhere he went, he dominated and took over cities. And this spirit was behind the world rulers of darkness that now include Tiglath-Pileser, includes Shalmaneser, includes Ben-Hasaradam, and other Assyrian kings who came to conquer. That's all they do. They can't think peace. Sort of like Putin. I don't know. Does he think about peace at all? I don't know. But these guys never did. They always thought of conquest because that was that was what he purposed to do. And then the third burden we looked at the end of chapter 14 was Philistia. Now, why does the Lord judge them? They're next to be judged because their carnal, uncircumcised flesh had been the perennial thief of Israel's inheritance. So whenever Israel got disunited and carnal and worshipped idols, the Philistines came right in and took over territory. So you see, all of these are evil. It's the world, the flesh, and the devil. The devil himself is judged first. And then comes Assyria, where men empowered by the devil are judged. And now we have flesh, which also must be dealt with by God. And so flesh is judged. And we see that in the picture of Philistia. Burden number 4 was Moab's judgment, which we studied last week in Isaiah 15 and 16. And why is Moab judged? Because before Jehovah's throne, Moab represented the seducing worldliness that seduced Israel with a sensual life. So the world, here is the world. Moab represents the world, the pride of the world, the civilized life of the world, the sensuality of the world that seduced the children of Israel when they were in the desert. Remember, before Baal Peor, they went into the temple and gave themselves to the prostitutes. And so 24,000 of them were killed. But so Moab always had that draw. You know, if I get across the river, I can have good times. It's like Las Vegas, you know, on steroids. And so the world is judged by the Lord. And so that brings us to the 5th and 6th burden tonight in Isaiah 17 and 18, which are the burdens regarding Damascus, Ephraim, we'll mention that in a minute, and Ethiopia, right? So if you see this list of the chapters in Isaiah 13 to 23, you see Damascus and Ethiopia. That's where we're at in these judgments. So number 1, Isaiah's prophecies, having dealt with the nations east and west, right? Moab on the east, Philistia on the west, now takes up those north and south, Ethiopia in the south and Damascus in the north. The emphasis of these 2 chapters is this: the word of Jehovah is the evil of making alliances with the world, making alliances with anybody. You remember King Ahaz, he made an alliance with Assyria. That was the worst thing he could do. It weakened Judah. They shut the temple. It was terrible. The alliance, it just caused oppression, weakness, and diminishing in Judah. So now there's a new African power, which is the primary emphasis here, which is called Ethiopia. Actually, it's not quite correct, but we'll leave it for now. It's actually in Hebrew Cush, and they're the Cushites. And so we'll be looking at that tonight. So now the Cushites have arose in power, and they come to Judah trying to form an alliance. Why? Because Assyria is still trying to conquer. They've already conquered Egypt several times, and now Cush has taken over Egypt, and now they want to form an alliance with Judah, try to keep Assyria out of their country. So that's what's going on there. All right, here we go. This is burden number 5, right? Isaiah chapter 7, Damascus. If you look there on this map, you can see Judah in red, northern Israel in the yellow, and in the green there, Aram or Syria. And if you look up in that corner there, you see Damascus, the city that's within Aram, or that's what it's called in Hebrew, or Syria as we know it today. Damascus and Ephraim are judged. Isaiah 7 through 12 already prophesied judgment upon Syria, but this burden has been included within the book of the judgments of the nations, right? The judgment actually focuses more upon the collateral damage due to Ephraim. And what does Ephraim stand for? Northern Israel, the 10 tribes that broke away from Jerusalem and Judah after Solomon died. So Ephraim was one of the largest tribes within the 10 tribes. Ephraim was the area in which Samaria, which became the capital of northern Israel. And so this is where, and so because Ephraim formed an alliance with Damascus, when God judges Damascus, Ephraim gets knocked down as collateral damage in a way, right? So we're going to see that tonight. Damascus is a great place to visit if you can get in there into Syria and get out alive. It's a great fortified city. It's called the oldest continually inhabited city in the world. Now, I like these kinds of claims, and the Europeans kind of make these claims. I kind of wonder if China doesn't have an older city or India does, but we'll leave it at that. They call themselves that. And today it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, which means they're fixing it up and making it an ancient site which you can still visit. Ancient Damascus was along the great east-west trade route between the East and between Africa. It just moved. It was just north of Mount Hermon, and you had to get around Mount Hermon one way or the other. 100 miles one way or the other. But on the trade route of Damascus, it became a great city because it was right on the way to the coast and down to Egypt. You remember King Ahaz, when he went so King Ahaz formed an alliance with Assyria and Tiglath-Pileser. And when Tiglath-Pileser went in and destroyed Damascus and took it over as a city, the city, or the Assyrians, not Syrians, but Assyrians, built a huge altar to Tiglath-Pileser in Damascus, which they had conquered. And King Ahaz went and saw that and said, "Oh, the great Tiglath-Pileser, we have to build an altar to him back in Jerusalem." And he went back to Jerusalem. He moved the brazen altar out of the way of the front of the temple, and he replaced it with this altar to Dagon, the fish god, dedicated to Tiglath-Pileser in God's holy temple in Jerusalem. What can I say about King Ahaz? Well, anyway, there you go. Of course, Damascus was also the place where Paul met Christ on the road, and he was baptized in the city's Barada River. If you go there, you see they have the exact spot where we know Paul was baptized according to church tradition. Right? All right, here we go. This is chapter 17, verses 1 through 4. The glory of Damascus will fade with Jacob's. And of course, Jacob is another word that means Ephraim or northern Israel, right? Listen to these words. The oracle concerning Damascus. Behold, Damascus is about to be removed from being a city and will become a fallen ruin. The cities of Aroer are forsaken. They will be for flocks to lie down in, and there will be no one to frighten them. The fortified city will disappear from Ephraim. Now you see already he switched from Damascus to Ephraim. And the fortified city of Ephraim was Samaria, which was totally destroyed. And sovereignty from Damascus and the remnant of Aram, Syria. and they'll be like the glory of the sons of Israel, declares the Lord of hosts. Now, in that day, the glory of Jacob will fade. And so they're talking about the fading away of Damascus in Syria, and along with it, the fading away of Ephraim. Damascus to become a ruin where sheep graze. He says the sheep will be able to graze through your city. And northern Israel's fortified city will disappear as well. And Jacob's glory will fade because of their alliance with Damascus. So here's a lesson. God's children should not get in these alliances. It didn't work out well. And we know, in fact, in 732 BC, Shalmaneser, Salmon Sneezer, as I call him, he came as an Assyrian, came and destroyed both Damascus and Ephraim, the two great cities of Syria and northern Israel. So we see that the glory of Ephraim and Damascus will be turned to frailty. And it just gives a list of pictures of what it'll be like in Damascus. Fatness will become lean. The wheat harvest will be carried like a gleaner in a man's arms because there's so little wheat out of the whole field. There'll be meager gleanings from the olive trees that going to olive trees after the olive trees have already been shaken and the harvest has already been done. Just a handful, picking up here and there, will be all that will be left of the glory of Damascus, a great, great, great city. And in verses 7 through 9, Jehovah caused this shaking to bring about a return of Ephraim to trusting the Holy of Israel. We see that there, right? It says in verse 7, on that day, man will look to his maker, and his eyes will look to the Holy of Israel, Kadosh Yisrael. He'll not look to the altars, the work of his hands, those idols, nor will he look to that which his fingers have made, even the Asherim and the incense altars. You know, throughout northern Israel, there were all kinds of altars to Baal and Asherah. Yes, everything will be, one day will cause Ephraim to turn back to the Lord. So here we see him further explain why Ephraim must be destroyed, because they've forsaken the God of salvation and their rock of refuge. Listen to these amazing words. For you've forgotten the God of your salvation. Is that possible? And you have not remembered the rock of your refuge. Therefore you plant delightful plants, set them with vine shoots of a strange God. On the day that you plant it, you carefully fence it in. And in the morning you bring your seed to blossom, but the harvest will flee on a day of illness and incurable pain. The rock Ephraim chose was Mount Gerizim. You see this picture here? It's kind of an interesting picture. This was actually taken, I would say, in the early 1900s and colorified, whatever you would call it. These are actually these are Samaritans in the 20th century who are still practicing the Samaritan religion. It's still a small but real group. They met outside Samaria. There on Mount Gerizim is where they built their great temple. They wrote their own law. They say they worship Jehovah God. And so there you see some in the early 20th century still worshiping up on Mount Gerizim. But they left the rock, which we know is Zion, and chose instead the curse of Mount Gerizim. So whatever they plant of false gods and poles and crops will all go to nothing. This is the burden. But the final footnote in verses 12 through 14 is this: woe to any nation who tramples upon Israel. So here's Assyria that came down, destroyed Damascus, they destroyed Ephraim, but woe to any nation who tramples upon Israel. Listen to these words. Alas, the uproar of many peoples who roar like the roaring of the seas, and the rumbling of the nations who rush on like the rumbling of mighty waters. The nations rumble on like the rumbling of many waters, but he will rebuke them, and they will flee far away and be chased like chaff in the mountains before the wind, or like whirling dust before a gale. At evening time, behold, there is terror. Before the morning, there is no more. Such will be the portion of those who plunder us, meaning Israel, and the lot of those who pillage us. So that final woe there in verse 12, hoi, is that word that means woe or alas, as it says in my verse 12 here. So the Lord, through all of this, is dealing with Israel. The Holy of Israel is dealing with crooked Israel to straighten her out. All of that oppression and weakness from forming alliances with Damascus has to be smashed. Because as they form alliances, they're forming a covenant. And you understand the covenant God demands only a covenant with him. And so he becomes jealous and his wrath comes forward because they're setting a covenant with of unbelief with the living God. And so we find that story. Now, we just take a little sidelight here for just a moment because it's interesting. And we'll do this with the matter of Egypt as well. Some end time scholars think there is a final fulfillment to this prophecy against Damascus. Now, of course, Damascus, as I said, in 732 BC was completely destroyed. So some say, well, Isaiah put this in the judgment of the nations, but it had already happened by the time he had written it. So if that's the case, is there some future fulfillment, right? Because it's being repeated. What's already been said, really, in chapters Isaiah 7 through 12. Second, because it's positioned in this judgment of the nations. But third, if the near fulfillment happened in 732, what is the final fulfillment? So end time Bible teachers their minds start to imagine things. So end time interpretation. Does this prophecy speak of the present Israeli-Palestinian conflict? These end time scholars take this whole section of Isaiah 15 through 20, and they see it as prophecy of Israel in the end times. Chapters 15 and 16 related to the West Bank, Moab. Chapter 17 related to Syria, Damascus, we just read it. Chapter 18 related to a nation tall and smooth, Ethiopia. Chapters 19 and 20, Egypt. They're all involved in end time Palestinian conflicts. Here is the burden of Damascus. It's the center of terrorism, where there was a nuclear blast, according to end time people, interpreting these very words we read. You got to have imagination, but you can see how they come up with some of this. In chapter 17, verse 1, Damascus destroyed in battle with Israel over the Golan Heights. Verse 2, Jordan is broken, and Aroer, which is mentioned there in verse 2, the cities of Aroer are forsaken. And of course, Aroer is modern day Ammon. And of course, Moab is modern day Jordan. Verse 3, Ephraim is the West Bank today. And with today's PLO headquarters in Ramallah, the city there in Ephraim, it will be destroyed. Verse 9, Israel will resort to nuclear weapons after the destruction of its strong cities, Tel Aviv, by terrorist missiles. And in verse 12 through 14, the sea of Arab nations will roar against Israel, who will look finally in this time to the Holy One of Israel. You see verse 9 there. In that day, man's strong cities will be forsaken places in the forest, or like branches which they have abandoned before the sons of Israel. And the land will be a desolation. Aha, you see, that's the nuclear weapons that have gone off and destroyed Damascus in a great end time battle. Well, are you buying it? What do you think? Yes, well, you see, this is how end time guys dig stuff out of the Word of God and use their fertile imaginations. Well, let's look at the next one here. Here we go. Now the burden in Isaiah 18 is the burden of Cush. Now this burden is not Massa. This burden is hoi, woe, or listen. Oive is this word, which is translated often, woe is me. It's what Isaiah said, woe is me. But it also means listen, or attention, or alas, or hoi. There's all kinds of translations that they come up with on this particular one. The burden of Cush. Now you see that map. It's important to see this. It's roughly in where Ethiopia would be today. You see, Egypt is above it, but Cush actually went down deeper. And I think most of you realize today, although you may have not have learned it in a typical American school in the history of Africa, I don't think much was taught about Africa, and so many people thought that African was just a primitive place, but they were amazing, large, strong kingdoms, like the Egyptians and the pharaohs. Cush was another one. They were populated by Nubians. That is to say, they were dark, black, tall people. So this is Cush. And it's actually more than Ethiopia. It actually covers Sudan and then modern day, even down below. It was a large, powerful African nation. So how does this come into the history? Well, the Cush history regarding this matter of Egypt and Judah has to do with this. Cush came up the River Nile and conquered Egypt in the 8th century BC. This is known in secular history. In 1715 BC, Shabako was the first pharaoh of the 25th dynasty of Egypt. And he was crowned the first pharaoh in the 25th dynasty. He had a couple, son and a son. And that dynasty lasted from 715 BC to 690 BC, as you can see, 25 years. When this conqueror, Shabako, became pharaoh, he immediately sent envoys to Judah to try to form an alliance against Assyria, which always came down through Judah. You understand, the Assyrians have to come down through Judah in order to get to Egypt. And so now Shabako knows about Judah. And, Judah, the only thing it has going for it is Jerusalem. It's so hard to take as a city, and it's out of the way. It's not on the coast, it's inland. And so they survive many of the wars between Egypt and Assyria. They went on for years and years and years. But let's look at the burden. It's burden number 6. Isaiah prophesies, and here not to that nation of Cush, or not to them, but to the envoys that are involved in transmitting information back and forth. So let's listen to these verses. Verses 1 and 2 of chapter 18 says this: "Ah, land of whirring wings that is beyond the rivers of Cush, which sends ambassadors by the sea and vessels of papyrus on the waters. Go, you swift messengers, to a nation tall and smooth, to a people feared near and far, a nation mighty and conquering, whose land the rivers divide." Well, now Cush has been joined with Egypt, whirring wings. Now, Hebrew scholars have no idea what this means. So they say it may be the nasty flies that were in Egypt. And we know, actually, Isaiah mentioned these nasty flies that would come up and sting Judah back in Isaiah 7:18. I'll show you why I'm laughing in a couple of minutes here. Anyway, so these envoys from Egypt travel up the Nile to Israel in boats made of papyrus reeds. And there is a picture of, you can see it isn't papyrus paper, it isn't a paper boat, but it's the reeds from which they made papyrus paper. And these reeds allowed a very shallow draft, because as they traveled up the Nile through various places, you had to pick up the boat. The boat was very light, when you're going up some cascades or rapids and so on and so forth. So this was the preferred vessel of transportation there along the Nile. So up comes this boat for the papyrus reeds with these envoys that come to, ask Judah to align with them against Assyria, right? Now, verse 2, when it says, "Go, you swift messengers," we might think it's talking about these envoys coming up from Cush, but evidently he's actually talking to the Judah messengers who are going back with a message to the Nubians. So Isaiah sends messengers swiftly back to this fearful nation, tall and smooth. The Cushites, Nubians, dark-skinned, tall, beautiful, handsome people. with a response from Jehovah of hosts regarding this suggested alliance. Let's go to verse 3 through 7. Jehovah of armies rests quietly in Zion. That's a very strange thing, right? He says in verse 3, all you peoples of the world, you who live on the earth, when a banner is raised on the mountain, you will see it. When a trumpet sounds, you will hear it. This is what the Lord says to me. I will remain quiet and will look on from my dwelling place, like shimmering heat in the sunshine, like a cloud of dew in the heat of harvest. Now the Lord says, wait. That's my message to the Cushites. Wait for Jehovah's direction by ensign and trumpet, by flag and shofar. In other words, Jehovah needs no alliances from mighty nations to destroy Assyria. He's saying, wait, I'm waiting, and I got a plan. You don't have to be aligned. Judah, don't sign an alliance with Cush. I've got this situation in hand. I am the all-powerful. I sit back and rest and watch all of this running up and down and envoys and people talking and worrying, trying to make. So you see, here we go in verse 4, you see, Jehovah is so great that he just watches and waits in Zion until things are ripe for his divine response against Assyria. Yes. Yeah, I've read that already. Okay, verses 5 and 6. Just at the right moment, Jehovah will cut off the fruit and the branches from Assyria, leaving it desolate. Verses 5 and 6, you see, it's why it's good to have your Bible open to these things. For before the harvest, when the blossom is gone and the flower becomes a ripening grape, he'll cut off the shoots with pruning knives, cut down and take away the spreading branches. They will all be left to the mountain birds of prey and to the wild animals. The birds will feed on them all summer, the wild animals all winter. That's my plan. Just when they think everything is ripe for conquest. And of course, you remember this is all about what happened when they came before Jerusalem during the reign of Sennacherib, and they spoke to King Hezekiah, and 185,000 of the soldiers were killed in one night. This is the greatest miracle in the time of Judah, of the divided kingdoms, spoken today by the Jews as the greatest miracle since the Passover, that is the crossing of the Red Sea. And then what will happen is, in verse 7, the mighty Cush will see Jehovah's power and send gifts of homage to Zion. So it says, at that time, gifts will be brought to the Lord Almighty from a people tall and smooth-skinned, from a people feared far and wide, an aggressive nation of strange speech, whose land is divided by rivers. The gifts will be brought to Mount Zion, the place of the name of the Lord Almighty. Now, this is actually mentioned in other places in the scriptures. It's interesting. In Zephaniah 3:10, I've got the little picture here, which is called perhaps the Cush, the prophetic whirlwind. And so it says, from beyond the rivers of Cush, my worshipers, my scattered people will bring me offerings. Now, this seems to be a reference to the Nubians, that is to sub-Saharan Africans being involved in the eventual millennium kingdom. That these people will see, as strong as they are, as mighty as their kingdom is, as much as they are to be feared, they will see that Jehovah is great, and they will come and rightly bear him gifts and join in his kingdom. So we see not a hostile prophecy against the Ethiopia, as it's called. No, not at all. But a word of warning. There's reasons that I'm not aligning, because I am the great Jehovah, and I do not need to be aligned to anyone large or small. I have the kingdoms in my hand. I have Assyria in my hand. Okay, so there is it's interesting because many Jews in the end, I mean Semitic Jews, escaped into Africa and were housed by the Nubians and the Cushites and the Ethiopians. We remember of the great Entebbe time when Israel brought back many of the Jews who'd been hidden from persecution down there in Africa by these noble Cushites. So there seems to be actually a positive plan for Ethiopia in the future, right? All right, now here again we have another example where end time scholars think that there are end time fulfillments to this prophecy regarding Cush. Number one, it's because the obscure figurative language of the Cushite whirlwind, all the Cushite phrasing, caused some to see prophetic hints of other nations in end time conflict. Now, the reason I'm laughing is that picture. See that picture of the land shadowing with wings? Well, this whirling wings, literally in Hebrew, is shadowing with wings beyond the river of Cush. Shadowing with wings. So here's somebody's picture because they think that this is talking about people tall and smooth being Americans, of course. How they got in this picture from Cush, it's hard to tell. But look at the picture. If you look closely, you see there's a bird in the middle. And he's got his wings spread. And this is what it means, the land shadowing with wings. Ah, that means North and South America. Whoa, hey, listen, you land of whirring wings along the rivers of Cush. It actually says in Hebrew, beyond the river Cush. You see, that means, west of the rivers of Cush, that gets all the way to wherever, right? But it does say in this message in Isaiah 18, listen, all ye inhabitants of the earth, to my judgments. I will bring this to pass. We just read that in chapter 18, verse 3, right? So if the near fulfillment happens to be this transaction, which took place between Cush and Judah, where they came to Jerusalem, actually, in history, you can read it, and I believe, I'm not sure if it's Chronicles or Second Kings, but it's in there. So if that happened, and in 715, we have the final destruction of Assyria in God's own time, in God's own way. So could there be a final fulfillment? Well, here I bring you two possibilities, both of which I think, I shouldn't say they're far-fetched, but, I don't want to upset people like Joy, who really are excited about all this kind of stuff. But anyway, the first interpretation is this. Isaiah 18 has to do with the 1948 rebirth of Israel. Now, all of you know, although you weren't born then, of course I was, but Israel became a nation in 1948 after World War II. So beyond the rivers of Cush equals Europe. The European nations, tall and smooth, right?
Could you say that again? My apologies. I couldn't hear what you said.
Sorry, my Siri is talking up here. So beyond the rivers here, the European nations get together and they grant Israel's right to become a nation. This is what this is talking about. The whirring wings of the airplanes and helicopters where they met and agreed on this proclamation that Israel could be a nation. The people tall and smooth, of course, Europeans. Why not? Brits, Englishmen, right? The water-soaked vessels were steamships that were filled with Israeli refugees. A lot of steamships came down from the Balkans and down from Europe after the war with many Jewish immigrants, and they were brought to the land of Israel. I don't know if any of you saw the Exodus, the movie with Paul Newman regarding this story, where many Jewish left Europe and came to seek refuge and life in Israel. So anyway, this is what they are saying this is all about. So the foreign allies attempt to form a secular Jewish homeland, right? The Jehovah sits back and watches this man-made plan unfold. In verses 6 and 5, Egyptian and Syrian forces are defeated as Jehovah raises his flag over the Golan Heights, which I don't know if you remember this, but it happened in the, hang on a second. Yeah, so here we go. The Egyptians and Assyria defeated. Jehovah raises the flag over the Golan Heights and the 1967 Six-Day War. I don't know if you know about this war, but in 6 days, Israel defeated Syria, Damascus, Egypt, Jordan. It was an amazing battle, amazing win. And so they remain a country to this day. Meanwhile, Jehovah sits back and lets his remnant be tried through persecution and everything through a continual great tribulation. So Israel as a nation has known nothing but constant embattlements and everything. Even as you saw on that newspaper, isn't that interesting? Going back to that thing a second, look at this. This is the New York Times. Zionists proclaim new state of Israel. Truman, our president, recognized it and hopes for peace. Tel Aviv bombed. Egypt orders invasion. And since the birth of Israel, they have gone through many days of Jacob's trouble. But so it has been. We see some, perhaps a fulfillment of Isaiah chapter 11, verses 11, 12. You remember that? We just read it before. It shall come to pass in that day, the Lord shall set his hand against the second time to recover the remnant of his people who are left from Assyria and Egypt, Pathros and Cush, Elam and Shinar, Hamath and the islands of the sea. He will set up a banner for the nations and will assemble the outcasts of Israel and gather together the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. So they kind of see this picture in Isaiah 18 being fulfilled. And a second end time interpretation is that Isaiah 18 is about the present Israeli-Palestinian relations again, as I mentioned regarding Damascus. In verses 1 through 2, the nation tall and smooth seems to be, somehow we get into this, I don't know, American Christians want to be in the Bible. They want their name found in the Bible. So here we are, a nation tall and smooth, seen as the USA, as envoys come with proposals of peace plans between Israel and Palestine. And there's our president, President Clinton, and there's Arafat, and there's Yitzhak, what's his name? Anyway, the president of Israel, and there's a Palestinian peace plan going on. The whirring wings again, fulfilled by the planes, the fearful envoys, tall and smooth, of course, is Clinton and the USA. The land divided by rivers in Mississippi. Well, it's a bit of a stretch, but anyway. Okay, now here. Meanwhile, Jehovah sits back and waits for tribulation and Jacob's trouble to unfold. All the attempts at whirlwind diplomacy fail. All the shadowing wings of flying back and forth, and this peace accord, and this, they're all broken and reset, and all these attempts fail. But when Israel sets their standard flag upon the Golan Heights on the West Bank, the shofar will signal the rapture of the church. Now, it's not clear how the rapture got in here, except the shofar is being blown. The trumpet shall sound in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, But anyway, this is the way it's interpreted. And then, of course, what's going to happen is this. Armageddon will eventually escalate into a great and nuclear conflict, after which it will take months to remove the bodies. Then the Messiah will return, and gifts will be brought to Zion from all nations. Now, so you can see, now we have to say that within these prophecies regarding Damascus and Ephraim and Ethiopia or Cush, there must be some truths abiding there. There's some important truths, and perhaps some future fulfillment that as of yet is in seed form and which we don't understand. I think often when these kinds of end time prophecies are given, though, they have to do a lot of imagining, and they have to take a lot of license with interpretation. And so I'm not sure that, these things are altogether conclusive at all. But there is I'm sure a further fulfillment of the judgment of the nations, according to their relationship to Israel, according to what they have done to the people of God, probably including Christians, how they've treated them. Because you remember Matthew 25 talks about the separating of the sheep and goats, and it all has to do with how people treated the nations, the nation of Israel, or the poor and the needy, and offered a cup of cold water, right? Well, then we conclude just here with a couple of final thoughts. Whether these end time prophecies are true interpretations, two great lessons can be learned from Isaiah 17 and 18. Very important lessons indeed. The first one, once again, God takes sovereign care of his people. And so he continues his care of Israel throughout history. Ups and downs and problems and terror and destruction and deaths. And yet in God's sovereign care, he's never forgotten his people right down through history because he has final purpose for him. So the destiny of nations depends upon their purposes and relations with Israel, whether of diplomacy, good, or indeed destruction. And in light of his sovereign care, full trust and reliance upon Jehovah is the only way God's people can survive in this hostile world. So it's simply saying that we need to trust in Jehovah and not in alliances and all that kind of stuff. That's the first thing we need to see. I know when you can get lost in the woods of the details of these prophecies, and many of them are quite picturesque. We don't really know sometimes even how to translate. When you read the commentaries that go into Hebrew, the Keil and Delitzsch, if you read that commentary, it goes into the Hebrew a lot. I'm telling you, you can really get in the woods. But the big picture is that there's a sovereign God who is great. He loves and cares for his people. And the second thing we learn interestingly from this passage is we must sometimes wait for Jehovah to move in our history. One of the great signs we see tonight of his power was, he says, I'm going to sit back and wait in Zion. Let men fiddle around, make their peace treaties, try to do this and that, manipulate. I'm just sitting back because I have a plan. And when I blow my trumpet, it's going to happen. And so it shows the greatness of God. And sometimes we need to wait and believe in that. So as I say here, sometimes the Lord waits while we try unsuccessfully to maneuver our circumstances using human wits and compromises before he'll move. He lets us just run out of our ideas and negotiations before he moves. As it says in Deuteronomy chapter 32, verses 8 and 9, when the Most High divided their inheritance to the nations, when he separated the sons of Adam, he set the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of the children of Israel. For the Lord's portion is his people. Jacob is the place of his inheritance. This wonderful verse which talks about a sovereign God who set the boundaries of Cush and of Damascus and of Assyria according to the number of the children of Israel. In such a way, all these boundaries will somehow interact and develop and make righteous his people so they can dwell in the coming kingdom. Well, there we have the study for tonight. Next week, we'll take up Egypt, different from Cush, but Egypt, and you might be surprised by the things we discover of God's dealings in his judgment of the nations, especially regarding Egypt. So that'll be next week. And so, by the way, it looks to me as I've looked on the calendar, I think we will probably have our first in-house meeting, God willing, at our meeting place on April 4th. I think it's probably better if we do the final judgments of the nations. That'll be next week, which is what, the 20-something rather. And then the following week, we have one more, some more nations to deal with. And then that comes to the end of this section of Book 2, the judgments of the nations. And so hopefully April 4th, I believe that's the Monday night, we'll meet personally. And from then on, we'll stream. We'll continue to stream for those who can't come. But on that Monday, April 4th, we'll plan to have dinner, and hopefully people will come. We'll have guitars and sing and worship, study the Word of God together. Okay. All right. Well, I only got 4 minutes before I don't know how